Imagine a city in flames. It is mid-November 1864 in Atlanta, Georgia. Night has fallen, but the sky glows an eerie orange. Union soldiers move methodically through the streets, torches in hand, setting ablaze anything that might aid the enemy. Buildings erupt in fire one by one. The crackling of timber and the roar of flames fill the air. General William Tecumseh Sherman stands on the outskirts of the city, watching the inferno. Atlanta, a crucial southern rail hub and industrial center, is burning on his orders. He knows the destruction behind him is shocking, even cruel, but in his mind it is necessary. This is the beginning of Sherman's audacious campaign of total war, a march of fire that will cut a swath of destruction across the Confederacy and bring a bloody civil war closer to its end. Sherman had captured Atlanta in early September 1864 after a long and arduous summer campaign. That victory was a major turning point. Atlanta's fall boosted Northern morale and helped ensure President Abraham Lincoln's re-election. Yet, despite the capture of the city, the Civil War was far from over. The Confederate armies had not yet surrendered, and Southern will to fight remained unbroken. Weary of the stalemate and determined to hasten the end of the war, Sherman devised a bold plan. Instead of simply occupying Atlanta or pursuing the retreating Confederate army directly, he would march his troops through the heart of the South, from Atlanta all the way to the Atlantic coast. Along the way, his men would live off the land and destroy the Confederacy's ability to wage war. Sherman believed that by bringing the war to the Southern home front, by literally making Georgia howl in pain, he could break the Confederacy's resolve. It was a radical strategy, one that would leave a deep scar across the South. General Sherman's plan was risky. He commanded approximately 60,000 seasoned Union soldiers, but to march deep into enemy territory without supply lines was unheard of. Once he left Atlanta, Sherman would cut his own communications and be completely isolated from the North until he reached the coast. If anything went wrong, his army could be stranded. Many in the Union High Command were anxious about this gamble. In Washington, some called it Sherman's dubious enterprise, and even President Lincoln had moments of doubt. But Ulysses S. Grant, the Union overall commander, eventually gave Sherman the green light, trusting his subordinates' judgment. Sherman quipped that he would make Georgia howl, and he meant it. He was confident that his men could forage for food and supplies as they went, and he intended to destroy every resource, railroads, barns, factories, crops, that might help the Southern war effort. It would be war not just against armies, but against anything that supported them. This concept, later known as total war, was about to be unleashed on Georgia. On November 15, 1864, Sherman put his plan into action. He ordered Atlanta evacuated and all military or industrial assets destroyed. That night, flames consumed Atlanta's train depots, arsenals, and factories. The fire jumped from building to building, accidentally engulfing homes too. By the next morning, nearly 40% of the city lay in ashes. Civilians who had once called Atlanta home were left wandering in shock, watching their city burn as the Union Army prepared to depart. The brutality of it all would never be forgotten by those who lived through it. For Sherman and his men, the destruction was a grim prelude of what was to come. At dawn on November 16th, Sherman's blue-coated columns snaked out of the ruins of Atlanta and into the Georgia countryside. The army had been divided into two large wings for the march. The left wing, under Major General Henry Slocum, headed east toward the city of Augusta. The right wing, under Major General Oliver O. Howard, marched to the southeast toward Macon. This had a strategic purpose. It confused the Confederate defenders as to Sherman's true objective. Would he strike Augusta with its gunpowder factories and mills? Or was he aiming for Macon, another important city? The Confederate forces in the region, few and scattered, shadowed the Union advance but could not mount a serious challenge. Unable to guess Sherman's target, they had to thinly guard everywhere, which meant effectively guarding nowhere. In reality, Sherman's true objective lay further on the horizon, the coastal port of Savannah, straight to the southeast. But by feinting toward multiple cities, he ensured that the Confederates were always reacting to his moves, never organizing a coordinated defense. The marching army stretched for miles and miles. Around 62,000 Union soldiers trudged along dirt roads and across plantations, singing war songs to keep their spirits high. Bands struck up lively tunes like John Brown's Body as the men stepped in unison. The soldiers joked that they were going to live high off the hog, and indeed they would. Sherman had issued Special Field Order 120, instructing his men to forage liberally off the land. For the Union troops, Georgia was abundant with food, and they helped themselves to what they needed. As the columns advanced, parties of soldiers spread out across the countryside, seizing chickens, cattle, pigs, corn, sweet potatoes, anything edible to fill the army's belly. They became expert foragers. These roaming soldiers were nicknamed bummers. The bummers ranged ahead into the sides of the main force, raiding farms and stripping warehouses. They carried torches to burn what they couldn't take. Thick plumes of smoke by day and flickers of distant fire by night marked their passage through the land. Sherman had given orders that civilians were not to be physically harmed, and that homes were to be spared unless used for sniping at his soldiers. But beyond those basic rules, almost everything else in Union Path was fair game for destruction. Railroads were a prime target. Sherman's men tore up miles of railroad track, vital links in the South's supply lines. The soldiers would pry up the heavy iron rails, pile up the wooden railroad ties, and set them on fire. They'd then lay the iron rails across the burning piles until the metal grew red hot. Working quickly and with cheers and laughter, troops would grab the softened rails and twist them around nearby trees or telegraph poles. The result was warped, corkscrew-like iron beams wrapped around tree trunks, irreparable and utterly useless. These twisted ruins were dubbed Sherman's neckties, a mocking symbol left all over Georgia to remind the Confederacy that Sherman had been there. With every mile the Union Army marched, more railroad lines were rendered into twisted scrap, cutting off town after town from communication and supply. Behind Sherman's army, Georgia was left in a state of devastation and confusion. Confederate General John Bell Hood, who had led the Southern Army defending Atlanta, was no longer in Sherman's way. He had taken his forces westward into Tennessee on a doomed campaign of his own, leaving Georgia practically defenseless. The only organized resistance Sherman faced on the march were bands of Georgia State Militia and the cavalry of Confederate General Joseph Wheeler. Wheeler's horsemen dogged the Union flanks, skirmishing here and there, but they were too few to turn the tide. Occasionally the march was punctuated by sharp, short clashes. At one such encounter, the Battle of Griswoldville on November 22nd, a column of Georgia militia, composed largely of old men and teenage boys, threw themselves desperately at a veteran Union brigade east of Macon. The Confederate militia, poorly trained and outgunned, charged valiantly across open fields. Union soldiers, experienced and armed with rapid-firing repeating rifles, mowed them down with grim efficiency. The fighting was brief and brutal. When the smoke cleared, over 1,000 Confederate militia lay killed or wounded, compared to only about 100 Union casualties. The field at Griswoldville was a sobering sight. Elderly farmers and young boys who hours earlier had been brave defenders of their homeland now lay dead on the ground. It was a tragic illustration of the reality. By late 1864, the Confederacy was scraping the bottom of the barrel for manpower, and even that would not be enough to stop Sherman's onslaught. Onward the Union Army marched, day after day, through forests and swamps and past plantations that once had been grand and prosperous. One of Sherman's men described the trail behind them as a desolate black streak, charred and empty. Another wrote in a letter home that they had made Georgia a desert. This was, after all, part of Sherman's plan, to show the South that its government could not protect it. And indeed, fear preceded Sherman's forces wherever they went. Rumors flew ahead. Sherman's coming. Many terrified Georgian families hid their silver and jewels, burying valuables in gardens or sinking them in wells in hopes the Yankees wouldn't find them. Some plantations were abandoned by their owners before the Union soldiers arrived, but many ordinary farmers and townsfolk had nowhere to run. They could only hunker down and pray the fury would pass over quickly. To those who experienced it, Sherman's march felt like the visitation of a dreadful storm or a biblical plague. Dolly Sumner Lunt, a widowed plantation owner in rural Georgia, had heard the rumors that Sherman's army was approaching. In her diary, she recorded the fateful day when that storm descended on her home. November 19, 1864. Dolly woke to the distant sound of gunshots and frantic warnings from neighbors that the Yankees are coming. Soon, a swarm of Union soldiers in dusty blue uniforms came tramping up her driveway. "Like demons they rush in," she wrote, describing how the men barged onto her property. "My yards are full. To my smokehouse, my dairy, pantry, kitchen, and cellar. Like famished wolves they come." The soldiers ransacked every building, prying open every door and cabinet in search of food or valuables. Dolly Lunt watched in dismay as they slaughtered her chickens and pigs for the cook fires and carried off hams, sacks of flour, jars of pickled vegetables, all the winter stores she had put away. Within minutes, barrels of molasses were spilled, feather beds torn open, family heirlooms stolen. Even her young daughter's doll was snatched by a laughing soldier as a souvenir, though mercifully, it was later dropped and returned to the little girl. Dolly ran to find an officer begging for protection. A Union captain briefly took pity and posted a guard by her door. But even he admitted there was little he could do to restrain hundreds of hungry and vengeful men, under orders to forage liberally. In her journal, Dolly Lunt painted the scene of chaos. Smoke from burning outbuildings choked the air. Livestock bellowed in panic as they were driven off, and formerly enslaved field hands, her servants as she called them, were shouting in confusion or fear. By the end of the day, Dolly's plantation was utterly plundered. "Utterly powerless, I stood by and witnessed it all," she wrote. The soldiers had even pressed a few of her enslaved laborers into guiding them or handling stolen goods, effectively liberating them by force. When the bluecoats finally marched on, Dolly Lunt was left with nothing but the clothes on her back and the smoldering remains of what had been a prosperous farm. It was a day she would recount with horror for the rest of her life. To her, Sherman's name became synonymous with devastation. Stories like Dolly Lunt's were repeating all across the path of Sherman's advance. But perspective is everything. What white Southern planters saw as an invasion of demons, many enslaved African Americans saw as an army of liberation. As Sherman's troops cut their path through Georgia, thousands upon thousands of enslaved people seized the opportunity for freedom. Upon hearing that the Yankees were nearby, enslaved families on plantations often dropped their tools and headed for the Union columns. They came by the wagon load or on foot, carrying children or elderly kin, bringing whatever meager possessions they could manage. These formerly enslaved people followed the Union Army cheering "Glory! Hallelujah!" as they crossed into Union-controlled territory. For them, Sherman's march meant emancipation at last. Every day of the march, the number of black refugees trailing behind the Union Army grew larger. Union officers were initially astonished by how many came streaming out of the plantations. Men, women, and children who had endured generations of bondage, now seeking safety behind Union lines. This growing throng of freedom seekers posed a humanitarian challenge that Sherman had not fully anticipated. His army suddenly had to worry about feeding and protecting thousands of extra mouths who weren't soldiers. Sherman was pragmatic. He needed to keep his army nimble and was concerned that too many refugees would slow him down. But he also didn't want to turn them away to face re-enslavement. In practice, many of the freed people did end up assisting the Union Army. They helped carry supplies, drove wagons, or guided troops along unfamiliar back roads. In a sense, they became part of the marching army, albeit an unarmed, trailing part of it. There were touching scenes as well. Some Union soldiers shared hardtack and coffee with the hungry families following them, and a few Army chaplains organized rudimentary refugee camps as temporary shelter. The liberation of these enslaved people was one undeniable good coming from the destruction. Yet the chaos of war could be cruel even to those seeking freedom. In one particularly tragic incident in early December, a large group of freed slaves trailing the army reached the banks of Ebenezer Creek, a dark, chilly swamp creek about 25 miles north of Savannah. The Union pontoon bridges were choked with troops and wagons crossing, and Confederate cavalry under General Wheeler was not far behind, harassing the rear guard. In a controversial decision, a Union commander ordered the bridge taken up before all the escaped slaves could cross, fearing an attack from behind. As the planks were pulled away, a panic broke out among the hundreds of freedmen left stranded on the far side of the creek with enemy horsemen approaching. Desperate not to be captured and re-enslaved, men, women, and children plunged into the deep, cold creek, trying to swim to the other side. Many could not swim at all. Tragically, dozens of people drowned in the muddy waters of Ebenezer Creek, and others were caught by the pursuing Confederates. Soldiers who witnessed the scene were horrified and tried to rescue whom they could, but the damage was done. The Ebenezer Creek incident cast a somber shadow over Sherman's campaign. It showed in the starkest terms that even as the Union Army brought freedom, it could not guarantee safety for all who grasped at it. Sherman later defended his officers' decision to remove the bridge as a necessary evil under pursuit. But Northern newspapers, when they learned of the episode, expressed outrage and sadness. The march was victorious, yes, but it was also filled with human tragedy. As November turned to December, Sherman's two wings maneuvered closer and closer to Savannah, Georgia's coastal gem. They had cut a 285-mile-long path of destruction across the state. The once bustling route was now littered with blackened chimneys, those lone chimneys of burnt houses which people grimly nicknamed Sherman's Sentinels, wrecked railroad cars and slaughtered livestock. Georgia was reeling. Sherman's men faced their last resistance outside Savannah's defenses. The city of Savannah, perched on the Atlantic coast, was protected by natural barriers of swamps and rivers, and by a series of forts and earthworks manned by Confederate troops. General William Hardee commanded the Confederate forces there, perhaps 10,000 men, a mix of regular soldiers and militia. That was a significant force, but Sherman now had about 60,000 victorious veterans at his command, flush from their march. By early December, Sherman had Savannah surrounded from the landward side. Yet, rather than launch an immediate assault or besiege the city in a lengthy encirclement, Sherman opted for a swift stroke to open a back door. Just south of Savannah on the Ogeechee River stood Fort McAllister, a stout Confederate earthwork fortification guarding the approach from the sea. That fort blocked Sherman's access to the Union Navy, which he knew would be waiting offshore with supplies and naval artillery. Taking Fort McAllister would reconnect Sherman with the outside world. On December 13, 1864, Sherman ordered a division of tough Western troops to storm Fort McAllister. The Union soldiers charged through swamps and exploded through the fort's abatis, tangled obstacles, in a furious frontal assault. Confederate cannons boomed, and musket volleys tore into the charging Federals, but nothing could stop the blue tide. In about 15 minutes of intense fighting, it was over. Fort McAllister fell, and with it, the last obstacle between Sherman and the Atlantic. Casualties were relatively light for such a daring attack, a few dozen killed on each side, and the outcome opened a lifeline. Once Fort McAllister was in Union hands, Sherman established contact with Union naval vessels waiting off the coast. For the first time in nearly a month, news from Sherman's army reached the north. A Navy officer greeted Sherman and excitedly asked, "How are you, General?" Sherman, with satisfaction, replied, "I'm all right. We've had the devil's own day, but we haven't been licked. The campaign is complete." One can only imagine the relief in Washington when Sherman's telegrams finally came through. The rumors and anxious speculation, some had even feared his army lost, were put to rest. In Washington, President Lincoln breathed easier knowing Sherman's men had survived and thrived on their march. With Savannah now effectively cut off, and the Union Navy delivering supplies to Sherman, the fall of the city was only a matter of time. Sherman sent a formal demand for surrender to General Hardee on December 17th. Hardee stubbornly refused. He was not inclined to hand over Savannah without a fight, but he also knew he could not withstand a direct assault or a prolonged siege. So Hardee made a daring escape plan. On the night of December 20th, under cover of darkness, the Confederate forces quietly withdrew from their trenches and crossed the Savannah River, evacuating toward South Carolina via a makeshift pontoon bridge. By the morning of December 21, 1864, the Confederate troops were gone, having slipped out of Sherman's noose. To avoid panic or looting, Savannah's civil authorities stayed behind to surrender the city properly. When Union troops marched in that day, they found Savannah defenseless and intact. A delegation of local officials formally surrendered Savannah to Sherman's representatives, and Union flags soon flew over the city's public buildings. Unlike Atlanta, Savannah was spared the torch. Sherman had achieved his objective without needing to destroy this beautiful city. Soldiers described Savannah as a welcome sight, a picturesque town largely untouched by war, with warehouses full of cotton and docks that would now serve the Union. Sherman entered Savannah in triumph. He found bountiful spoils, 25,000 bales of cotton, heavy artillery, ammunition, and other supplies that the Confederates had left. Elated by his success, Sherman sat down and penned a famous telegram to President Lincoln. In it he wrote, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah, with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, and also about 25,000 bales of cotton." It was December 22nd, just days before Christmas, and Sherman knew how symbolic this victory was. When Lincoln received Sherman's message, he was overjoyed. The gift of Savannah was the perfect capstone to a successful year for the Union war effort. In a reply, the president gratefully wrote that, "The honor is all yours, for I believe none of us went further than to acquiesce," essentially acknowledging that Sherman's bold plan had been a spectacular success, one that many had cautiously only acquiesced to rather than fully endorsed at first. The news of Savannah's capture and Sherman's completed march electrified the North. Northern newspapers that winter sang Sherman's praises, calling him a modern Hannibal, or comparing him to a hurricane that uprooted the Confederacy. The South, conversely, was plunged into despair. The Union had carved out the heart of Georgia. One of the Confederacy's last untouched regions was now ravaged. For the Southern populace, the realization hit hard. If Sherman could march at will through Georgia, was any part of the Confederacy safe? Confederate soldiers on the front lines, hearing the fate of their hometowns through letters, felt a bitter blow to morale. Many desertions in the Confederate ranks accelerated after the fall of Atlanta and the march to the sea. Men going home to try to help their families, or simply losing hope that the war could be won. By destroying the Confederacy's material ability to fight and its psychological will to resist, Sherman's campaign dealt a grievous wound from which the South would not recover. However, even with Savannah's fall, the Civil War was not yet formally over. General Robert E. Lee still commanded the Confederacy's largest remaining army in Virginia, locked in a stalemate with Grant at Petersburg, and remnants of other Confederate forces were regrouping in the Carolinas. Sherman understood that his job was not finished. After resting his troops briefly in Savannah and regrouping in early January, he turned his sights northward. What came next was the final act of Sherman's grand campaign, an extension of the march, now through the Carolinas. If Georgia had been made to howl, Sherman was determined to make South Carolina, the very cradle of secession, pay an even heavier price. In late January 1865, Sherman's armies left Savannah and began moving north. Some soldiers half-joked that they would now give South Carolina a taste of war even more severe than Georgia's. There was a palpable hunger for retribution among Union troops toward South Carolina, which they saw as the instigator of the rebellion. One Union officer wrote in his diary, "The whole army is burning with an insatiable desire to wreak vengeance upon South Carolina. I almost tremble at what may happen." As the Union columns marched into South Carolina, that prophecy came true. The destruction was brutal. The Federals found little food in South Carolina's winter fields, but what they could not carry or use, they burned with a vengeance. Farmhouses and plantations suspected of belonging to ardent secessionists were put to the torch. Soldiers later admitted that they showed less restraint in South Carolina, the state that started it all, than they had in Georgia. Sherman's men pushed through rain-soaked swamps and muddy roads, driving toward the state capital, Columbia. On February 17, 1865, they reached Columbia and found the Confederate forces were evacuating. The mayor surrendered the city, and Union troops entered. At night, chaos engulfed Columbia. Somehow fires broke out across the city. To this day, historians argue over exactly how. Some blame retreating Confederate soldiers for setting cotton bales ablaze on their way out, hoping to deny them to the Yankees, only for the fires to get out of control. Others blame drunken Union soldiers, enraged at South Carolina, deliberately lighting the city up. It was likely a combination of accidents and intentional destruction. By morning, much of downtown Columbia was a smoking ruin. Sherman's troops worked to put out the flames by dawn, but the damage was extensive. The fall of Columbia was a symbolic blow from which the Confederacy would not recover. The birthplace of secession was in ashes, now firmly in Union hands. To the south, the burning of Columbia became proof of Sherman's barbarity. To Sherman, it was an unfortunate but not undeserved fate for the hotbed of rebellion. He noted only that Columbia, the capital of South Carolina, will have to burn in a dispatch, expressing no remorse. Meanwhile, to the east, the port of Charleston, South Carolina, where the first shots of the war had been fired at Fort Sumter in 1861, was also evacuated by Confederate troops a few days after Columbia fell. Union forces occupied Charleston on February 18, 1865. The once proud city was battered after years of siege and bombardment, but its capture, following Sherman's march through the state, felt like a final justice to many Northerners. The cradle of the rebellion was now finally subdued. Sherman did not pause for long in Columbia. Pressing north into North Carolina, his troops entered a state that was somewhat less defiant. North Carolina had been the last Southern state to secede and had a stronger Unionist streak among its citizens. Sherman reportedly instructed his men to treat North Carolina with a lighter touch than South Carolina. Even so, destruction followed in the Army's path there as well, though not as wanton as in South Carolina. By March 1865, the Confederacy had managed to cobble together one more field army to oppose Sherman. Under the command of General Joseph E. Johnston, the same General Sherman had maneuvered against in Georgia earlier in the war. Johnston was a shrewd commander, and although he had far fewer men than Sherman, he hoped to catch part of Sherman's army at a disadvantage and perhaps deal it a serious blow. The opportunity came in mid-March 1865, when Sherman's forces were moving in two separated wings in North Carolina. Johnston rapidly concentrated his troops, about 20,000 strong, and struck at one wing of Sherman's army, about 30,000, Union troops in a place called Bentonville on March 19th. The Battle of Bentonville was the largest pitched battle that Sherman's army had fought since leaving Atlanta. For 2 days, furious fighting raged amid the pine forests and swamps. At first, Johnston achieved some surprise, pushing back the Union advance guard, but Sherman's veterans quickly recovered. They were battle-hardened and far more numerous than the Confederates. By March 21st, Sherman had united both wings of his army and counterattacked, nearly trapping Johnston's force. Johnston retreated in haste, having failed to achieve a decisive victory. The Battle of Bentonville proved to be the dying gasp of the Confederate resistance in the Carolinas. Sherman's losses were relatively light, and his march barely slowed. As Sherman pushed onward, he captured the state capital, Raleigh, in April. By now, it was clear to everyone that the Confederacy was on its last legs. The relentless Union campaigns had squeezed the life out of the Southern rebellion from all sides. In Virginia, General Grant's forces finally broke through Lee's lines at Petersburg, forcing Lee to abandon the Confederate capital of Richmond on April 3, 1865. Lee's dwindling army tried to flee west, but Grant pursued and trapped them. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, a momentous event that effectively sealed the fate of the Confederacy. News of Lee's surrender reached Sherman in North Carolina shortly thereafter. The Confederate cause was lost. General Johnston, upon hearing of Lee's capitulation and seeing Sherman's overwhelming numbers in front of him, knew that further bloodshed was futile. He reached out to Sherman to discuss surrender. The two generals, Sherman and Johnston, met on April 17, 1865, at a farmhouse in Durham Station, North Carolina, to negotiate terms. In an interesting historical footnote, the first day they met, both men learned that President Lincoln had been assassinated just days earlier. The shocking news cast a pall over their meeting. Despite that, Sherman was determined to carry out Lincoln's intent to bind up the nation's wounds. He offered Johnston generous surrender terms, even more generous than what Grant had given Lee, including political provisions. Washington, however, rejected Sherman's initial terms for overstepping his authority on political matters, forcing Sherman and Johnston to reconvene. Finally, on April 26, 1865, Johnston surrendered his army, the last major Confederate army, to Sherman, under terms virtually identical to Appomattox. An interesting camaraderie had grown between these two adversaries. Sherman even gave Johnston's men the food rations they desperately needed. With this surrender, the fighting in the Carolinas ceased. The Civil War, at least the large-scale military conflict, was effectively over. Sherman's campaign of fire had reached its end, having accomplished exactly what he intended. The war that had dragged on for 4 long years was brought to a close just months after Sherman's march. The relentless pressure Sherman applied across Georgia and the Carolinas had made it impossible for the Confederacy to continue. By destroying the South's ability to support its armies in the field, tearing up its railroads, burning its factories and supply depots, and freeing the labor force, slaves, that sustained its plantations, Sherman hastened the collapse of the Confederate war effort. Many historians would later argue that Sherman's march to the sea and his Carolinas campaign shortened the war and saved lives in the long run, by preventing further drawn-out trench warfare or guerrilla resistance that might have gone on for months or years. But such strategic outcomes came at a tremendous cost to Southern land and property, and to the psyche of its people. In the North, William T. Sherman was hailed as a hero, the very embodiment of Union resolve. Northern newspapers in 1865 were filled with praise for the general who dared to march where no armies had marched before, cutting the Confederacy in two and bringing rebels to their knees. Sherman's own soldiers adored him, affectionately calling him Uncle Billy. They admired his iron will, his ability to live rough just as they did, and the way he led them to victory time and again without unnecessary slaughter. Indeed, one notable aspect of Sherman's march is that, Compared to other campaigns of the Civil War, it involved relatively few pitched battles, and thus relatively fewer casualties. Sherman's men certainly died in skirmishes and from disease and accidents, but the campaign's design was to avoid set-piece battles by maneuver and psychological intimidation. In that sense, Sherman achieved a great deal with fewer Union lives lost than if he had chosen to, say, attack fortified cities head-on repeatedly. Union families, grateful to see their boys return home alive when the war ended, had Sherman in part to thank. In the South, however, Sherman became the most hated man of the Civil War. More than Ulysses S. Grant, more than Lincoln, it was Sherman who came to symbolize the pain and humiliation of defeat. Southern mothers would tell misbehaving children, "Sherman will get you if you don't watch out," as a kind of boogeyman. The phrase Sherman's sentinels, those lone chimneys standing in fields, became a bitter reminder of what had been lost. Once gracious plantations were now skeletal ruins. Cities like Atlanta and Columbia had to literally rise from ashes in the years after. For generations in Georgia and South Carolina, the memory of Sherman's march was passed down in stories of woe, of priceless family heirlooms looted or destroyed, of grand homes reduced to cinders, of hunger and hardship in the wake of the blue-coated invaders. Sherman himself did not apologize for his actions. He famously said, "War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it." In his view, the harsh measures he used were justified by the goal of ending the far greater cruelty of the Civil War itself. He believed that sparing the South refinement of war would only prolong the conflict. Therefore, he brought war in its most unrefined, raw form to the South's doorstep to force a conclusion. That statement, "War is cruelty," encapsulates Sherman's legacy. He did what he thought necessary to save the Union and end slavery, and he did it with ruthless efficiency. After the war, he was unapologetic about the destruction, though he did privately admit that he never liked being called brutal. Sherman insisted that his aim was to avoid killing civilians, and indeed few if any civilian deaths were directly attributed to his march. Most people fled or hid. It was property that suffered, but he had no qualms about making civilians homeless or penniless if it would break their support for the Confederate cause. This philosophy of total war was a grim one, and it foreshadowed the even harsher wars of the 20th century. In the spring of 1865, however, what mattered to Sherman and to the Union was that the war was won. The Union had been preserved, and slavery, the cause of that war, was abolished forever by the 13th Amendment. The price paid by the South was steep, and no campaign exacted a price quite like Sherman's. In a matter of weeks, his men had demolished infrastructure that took decades to build. Sherman estimated that his march inflicted $100 million worth of damage in 1864 dollars, an astronomical sum at the time. The once rich state of Georgia was left impoverished and would remain economically shattered for years. The same was true for much of South Carolina. A Southern poet later lamented that Sherman's path was a trail of woe and death, where flourishing farms became barren wasteland overnight. And yet, as severe as it was, Sherman's campaign had a certain stark logic. It broke the back of a rebellion and likely saved lives by ending the killing sooner. Many Union soldiers took a grim pride in that logic, believing they had been instruments of righteous judgment. There was even a popular song written shortly after the war called "Marching Through Georgia" that jubilantly celebrated the campaign. It became a sort of anthem of Union victory, though it enraged Southerners to hear it. Sherman himself reportedly didn't like the song much, perhaps feeling it made light of a very serious endeavor. In the aftermath of the war, Sherman and the former Confederate General Johnston actually became friendly. In a poignant footnote to their story, when Sherman died in 1891, Joe Johnston served as a pallbearer at his funeral in New York. It was February and chilly. Johnston, an elderly man, refused to wear a hat as a sign of respect for Sherman, even as a cold rain fell. He caught pneumonia and died a few weeks later. Thus the two old foes, the Union general who burned his way to victory and the Confederate who tried to stop him, departed the world almost hand in hand. In that gesture of respect and reconciliation, one can glean a hopeful epilogue. The nation, though scarred and burned, did heal. Today, historians still debate Sherman's tactics and morality, but none dispute the impact of his march to the sea. It has become legend, a story of destruction and resolve that has been told and retold in countless books, documentaries, and classrooms. You can't talk about the Civil War's end without talking about Sherman's campaign. The term scorched earth is forever linked with Sherman. In Georgia, The memory is practically woven into the folklore of the land, and in the broader sweep of history, Sherman's march stands as perhaps the first modern example of total war, making even civilians feel the hard hand of battle to force a political result. Sherman once wrote to a colleague, "If the people raise a howl against my barbarity and cruelty, I will answer that war is war, and not popularity seeking." He had no interest in being loved, only in being effective. And effective he was. His march of fire through Georgia and the Carolinas broke the Confederacy's spine and made further resistance futile. It is a testament to his campaign success that after Savannah, there were really no more significant victories the Confederacy could hope for, just delaying the inevitable. In the end, General Sherman's Fire March achieved exactly what its subtitle suggests. It burned its way into history. The images are unforgettable. Atlanta in flames, endless lines of Union soldiers cutting through swamps and cotton fields, railroads twisted beyond use, columns of liberated slaves joining the march, and a proud Southern civilization, built over centuries, brought to its knees in a matter of weeks by fire and steel. This was how one man's ruthless campaign helped end America's deadliest war. The Civil War concluded not just with the parlor room surrender at Appomattox, but also with the smoldering ruins left by Sherman's army, a reality that underscored the Union's triumph and the Confederacy's total defeat. As the smoke cleared and peace returned, the United States faced the immense task of rebuilding and reconciliation, but the Union was saved. The stars and stripes flew again over the lands that had risen in rebellion. Enslaved people were free, and William Tecumseh Sherman, the general who had marched across Georgia to make it so, passed into the annals of history, feared by some, revered by others, and undeniably one of the most consequential figures of the Civil War. His march will forever be remembered, a march of destruction, a march of liberation, a march that was both horrifying and crucial. Sherman's march of fire ensured that the war would finally end. It was the brutal, fiery final act that preserved a nation, and though more than a century and a half has passed, the legend of that march, its ruthlessness and its purpose, still captures our imagination. It remains truly a campaign that burned its way into history,